Imagine you build like a state-of-the-art fighter jet right in Texas. I mean, it is an absolute marvel of American engineering.
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds of millions of dollars, decades of research.
Right, the absolute pinnacle of aerospace technology.
Hmm.
But you can't sell it. You can't fly it. In fact, you can't even finish building it on the assembly line.
Because of one single microscopic bottleneck.
Exactly. Because some bureaucrat in Beijing decided not to sign a piece of paper. A piece of paper authorizing the export of a specific mineral that makes up like 0.1% of the paint on the engine.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. But welcome to the new global reality, and welcome to another deep dive. Today is May 11th, 2026, and you, our inherently curious listener, are joining us at a moment where the global tectonic plates are actively shifting under our feet.
Yeah, because in exactly 2 days, for the first time in nearly a decade, an American head of state is stepping off a plane in Beijing.
Right, for a massive presidential summit.
The bilateral meeting at the Diayutai State Guest House. I mean, it is the culmination of years of mounting pressure.
The stakes simply couldn't be higher. So our mission today is to cut through all the standard diplomatic noise. You know, the cable news shouting matches and all that.
We want to get to the actual foundation of it all.
Right. We're going to help you understand the hidden architecture of this global standoff. Like, what does this summit mean for everything from the price of gas you put in your car this afternoon to the literal microscopic components inside the phone in your pocket right now?
And to do that, we're relying on a single, incredibly detailed piece of analytical forecasting.
Yeah, it's a report from the Global Review by Farid Novin, and it's titled The Trump-Beijing Summit 2026.
It is honestly a phenomenal text for just understanding the underlying mechanics of modern statecraft.
It really is. But before we get into those mechanics, we need to pause and make something explicitly clear to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
Today's source material covers some highly sensitive, very politically charged global events. I mean, we are talking about U.S. and Chinese domestic politics, the recent Israel-Iran military conflict.
The closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, and the sovereignty of Taiwan.
Yeah.
We must state clearly that we are not taking sides here. We are not making judgments, and we are absolutely not endorsing any of the viewpoints, policies, or actions of the political figures, parties, or nations we are about to discuss.
Exactly. Our only job in this deep dive is to impartially convey the factual reporting and the analytical frameworks exactly as they are presented in our source text.
The goal here is strict comprehension. You know, we are mapping the territory, not telling you who to root for.
Couldn't said it better.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think the best way to visualize the global economy right now isn't like a spreadsheet or a map. It's an engine.
An engine, right.
Yeah, and for the last few decades, the United States essentially controlled the software of that engine. You know, the financial systems, the global alliances. Meanwhile, China has been quietly manufacturing the physical circuitry.
The rare earth metals, the supply chains, all the hardware.
Exactly. But right now, the entire engine is just sputtering because the fuel line has been pinched shut. It's like this massive Jenga tower where 3 foundational blocks have just been yanked out all at once. And the most immediate crisis driving this summit is a massive energy shock.
Yeah, the source data on this is incredibly stark. The International Energy Agency characterizes what we are living through right now as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
Which is saying something.
It really is. Following the U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran on February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed.
Just to picture this geographically, for anyone who hasn't looked at a map recently, we are talking about a maritime choke point that is only 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point.
Right, it's tiny. And that tiny passage normally handles 20% of the world's seaborne crude oil and like 20% of its liquefied natural gas.
Wow.
But since the Revolutionary Guard Corps began enforcing shipping restrictions, the insurance premiums for maritime transit have just skyrocketed.
I mean, to the point where commercial traffic has dropped to just 5% of its normal volume.
Exactly 5%.
So 95% of the ships that normally carry the lifeblood of the global economy through that strait are simply gone. They're rerouted or just sitting idle.
And the physical reality of that missing oil triggered immediate violent financial ripples. I mean, Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel in March.
And the report notes that in the U.S., gasoline prices spiked by $1.16 a gallon in just 6 weeks.
North American jet fuel jumped 95%. And over in Europe, natural gas benchmarks nearly doubled as markets just panicked over the upcoming winter reserves.
Wait. If the global supply is constrained that severely and gas prices are spiking everywhere, doesn't China get roughly half of its seaborne oil supply through that exact same strait?
They do, yeah.
Shouldn't Beijing be panicking just as much as Washington or London?
Well, you would naturally assume that, but the analysis reveals this massive structural irony. China actually entered this crisis from a position of relative comfort,
Really?
because Chinese state refiners had quietly built up around 120 days of strategic cover. Plus, there was already an enormous amount of cheap, heavily discounted Iranian crude floating on the water bound for Chinese ports before the strait even closed.
Oh, wow. So while the U.S. and Europe are taking a direct hit to their consumer economies, China is just sitting on this massive buffer.
Exactly. It completely flips the traditional geopolitical dynamic. China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian crude, so that economic relationship grants Beijing unique diplomatic leverage in Tehran.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they already hosted the Iranian foreign minister in Beijing shortly after the conflict began. So, right at the moment the U.S. consumer is feeling the most acute economic pain from energy prices, China steps onto the world stage holding the keys.
So they've positioned themselves as the indispensable broker, like the only power capable of potentially influencing Tehran to reopen the strait. But, I mean, if the U.S. consumer is hurting at the pump and China is holding all the diplomatic leverage in the Middle East, why did the U.S. even agree to this summit? It sounds like the American delegation is walking straight into a trap where they have to beg for favors.
Well, that brings us to the domestic pressures facing the two men sitting across the table from each other. Both leaders are heavily constrained by their own internal politics, but they approach the negotiation with entirely different psychological frameworks.
Right, because Trump is looking at the 2026 midterm elections.
Yes. The administration needs to project strength and secure visible, commercially legible wins to offset the economic frustration at home.
Which completely explains the guest list. I was looking at the American delegation flying to Beijing, and it reads like a corporate boardroom.
Oh, totally. Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Larry Fink from BlackRock.
CEOs of Goldman Sachs and Citi. I mean, this isn't just a diplomatic mission. Washington is framing this as a giant business merger.
What's fascinating here is how the report defines this approach perfectly. It calls the U.S. strategy transactional nationalism.
Transactional nationalism.
Right. The U.S. views geopolitics through a competitive mercantilist lens. They are looking for tangible deliverables, things you can literally point to on a graph.
Like massive agricultural purchases from China.
Exactly. They want to finalize an Alaska liquefied natural gas deal. They want to set up this proposed bilateral board of trade mechanism.
But Xi Jinping isn't looking at this as a quarterly earnings report, is he?
Not at all. The source contrasts the U.S. approach with Xi's civilisational statecraft. Xi operates on historical continuity and, really long horizon planning.
So he doesn't view China as just another nation state haggling over soybean prices.
No, he views China as a civilisational state returning to its rightful historical position at the center of the global order.
So if Trump is playing for November 2026, Xi is playing for 2049.
Precisely. The Chinese strategic assessment is that the overarching structural trends of the 21st century favor Beijing. They look at the U.S. and see deep internal polarization.
Right.
They see Western alliances fracturing under the weight of U.S. economic policies, and they see the global South steadily marching toward a multipolar world order where American hegemony is, well, diluted.
But Xi isn't immune to gravity either, because the source notes China is dealing with a serious domestic economic deceleration, right?
Oh, absolutely. They desperately need export stability to keep their factories running. And that means they need predictability regarding U.S. tariffs.
So both sides are bleeding. The U.S. is facing profound military overstretch. I mean, the rapid expenditure of advanced munitions and defense resources in the Middle East, coupled with the ongoing drain of the Ukraine conflict.
It has severely depleted American stockpiles. The Pentagon is stretched incredibly thin.
So China needs economic stability. But how can they demand that when the U.S. has been waging a tariff war for years? Like, why isn't Washington just using those tariffs to squeeze Beijing right now to get what they want?
Because the tariff weapon was largely dismantled a few months ago.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the report highlights a critical legal development from February 2026. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down the emergency tariffs Trump had implemented under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
Oh, wow. I completely missed the impact of that.
It was huge. Because of that ruling, the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods plummeted from a staggering 140% peak down to just 23.69%.
Wait, If the U.S. lost its primary economic weapon and the tariffs are just hovering around 23%, where is the American leverage? Why isn't the U.S. just reapplying pressure through other legislative means?
Well, because Washington is terrified of what happened the last time they pushed Beijing to the brink. And this introduces the concept of precarious interdependence.
Okay, tell me about that.
Back in 2025, when those U.S. tariffs hit that 140% peak, China decided to show the world what actual economic leverage looks like. They deployed their break glass weapon.
Rare earth minerals.
Exactly. The materials that basically make the 21st century function. In April 2025, China restricted exports on 7 critical rare earth elements. Then, in October 2025, they dropped the hammer.
What did they do?
They restricted 12 more elements, and crucially, they introduced an unprecedented 0.1% extraterritorial rule.
Let me make sure I understand this, because this detail completely blew my mind when I read the report. The 0.1% rule. How does that physically work in the real world?
Okay, imagine a company in Germany is manufacturing a high-performance magnetic motor, right? And they want to sell that motor to an aerospace company in France.
Okay, Germany or France. Got it.
Under this October 2025 rule, if even 0.1% of the value of that German motor comes from a Chinese-origin rare earth magnet, the German company cannot legally sell it to the French company without first obtaining an export license from the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing.
That is insane. Like, China essentially copyrighted the base ingredients for modern technology, and now they're charging a geopolitical royalty on everything built with them, no matter where it's assembled.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. And the downstream consequences of that geopolitical royalty were immediate and devastating.
I bet.
Look at yttrium, which is vital for the thermal barrier coatings on jet engine turbine blades. Following the restrictions, global exports of yttrium plummeted from 333 tons down to just 17 tons.
Oh my God.
Yeah. U.S. aerospace manufacturers were suddenly facing catastrophic production pauses. By early 2026, the report notes there was literally only one remaining manufacturer of rare earth permanent magnets in the entire United States, a company called Novion Magnetics.
You can't fight a trade war if you don't have the materials to build the defense systems required to project power. I mean, Washington must be reacting to this. They can't just accept that Beijing controls the supply chain for their own fighter jets.
They are reacting, sure, but building supply chains takes time. The source points to Project Vault, which is a $12 billion U.S. initiative designed to stockpile critical minerals.
Okay, that's something.
There is also the 4G alliance with Australia, which absorbed 45% of all global rare earth exploration investment last year. And the U.S. Export-Import Bank is throwing billions of dollars at alternative sources. But as analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies conclude, you can announce a mining project tomorrow, but translating that announcement into actual refined minerals takes years, sometimes a decade. Self-sufficiency is a very long road.
And Washington doesn't have a decade.
Yeah.
Because that massive October 2025 rare earth restriction, the one that paralyzed the aerospace industry, it wasn't permanently lifted, was it?
No, it was only temporarily suspended. At the Busan summit, China agreed to a one-year suspension of those rules, and that suspension expires in November 2026.
So there is a literal ticking clock hanging over the table at this Beijing summit.
A structural deadline that forces both sides to find a workable equilibrium before the global supply chain just freezes over again.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because, okay, you can stockpile minerals. You can haggle over tariff percentages or the tonnage of soybean exports or the price of liquefied natural gas.
Right. Those are commodities.
Exactly. You can put them on a spreadsheet and negotiate a price. But that transactional approach hits a brick wall when you get to the one thing on the table that cannot be priced out, which is the sovereignty of Taiwan.
Taiwan remains the absolute most structurally dangerous flashpoint in the bilateral relationship, period.
And the signals coming out of Washington right now seem totally chaotic.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, the report notes the U.S. just approved a massive $11 billion arms package to Taipei, clearly designed to harden their defenses.
Yes.
But then, literally this morning, May 11, President Trump publicly stated that U.S. arms sales to Taiwan would be on the agenda at the summit, heavily implying that they are a negotiable asset.
And trading security commitments for commercial concessions is incredibly dangerous. In strategic theory, this contradictory signaling creates what analysts call a compound deterrence failure.
Hold on, compound deterrence failure sounds like a thick piece of academic jargon. What does that actually mean in the minds of the people on the ground? like the military commanders in Taipei or the policymakers in Beijing?
Well, the entire premise of deterrence relies on psychological clarity. Your adversary has to believe that if they cross a line, you will absolutely fight back.
Right.
A compound deterrence failure happens when you scramble that psychology. By approving an $11 billion weapons package, Washington is arming Taiwan for a potential war.
Showing strength.
Exactly. But by simultaneously announcing that those weapons are as bargaining chips for a trade deal, Washington is signaling to Beijing that America has no genuine ideological interest in fighting that war.
Oh, wow. So you are handing your ally a gun, but telling your enemy you won't supply the bullets if the price of oil drops. You are creating a massive credibility vacuum.
And vacuums invite aggression. The Center for American Progress warned that Washington is systematically undermining its own credibility here because China is watching this internal American confusion very closely.
They have to be.
Xi Jinping met with the chairwoman of Taiwan's opposition party, the Kuomintang, in April 2026, and he stated publicly and unequivocally that China will never tolerate independence.
Because for Xi, this isn't about microchips or trade imbalances.
It is an existential issue of regime legitimacy and national identity. It is simply not up for debate.
Which is probably why a bipartisan group of U.S. senators sent a frantic letter to the White House today, urging the president not to use Taiwan as a negotiating pawn.
The anxiety in Washington is palpable, but the real danger here, as Bonnie Glaser from the German Marshall Fund points out in the report, isn't necessarily a formal treaty where the U.S. explicitly abandons Taiwan.
What is it then?
The danger is ambiguous language. The danger is a tacit, unspoken understanding coming out of this summit that appears to concede a sphere of influence to Beijing.
Ah, I see.
Because if China believes the U.S. lacks the political will to respond, they might be emboldened to take more assertive, gray zone military actions around the island.
So if we pull back and look at the whole board, we have a crippled global energy supply, a ticking clock on rare earth minerals, and a massive credibility vacuum regarding a potential war over Taiwan. How do the analysts see this actually playing out?
Well, the report relies on a Bayesian game theoretic framework to map out the probabilities of different summit outcomes.
Wait, Bayesian game theoretic framework. Again, that sounds like a mad PhD thesis.
Oh.
What does that actually mean for two politicians sitting in a room trying to strike a deal?
Think of it like playing high-stakes poker, but you don't fully know the rules of the game until the cards are being dealt.
Okay, I like that analogy.
In a Bayesian model, you start with a baseline assumption about your opponent's red lines. Then, every single action they take, a public statement, a military drill, a tariff reduction, is treated as new data.
So you are constantly updating your math.
Right. You constantly update your mathematical probability of what they will do next based on that new evidence. Because Washington and Beijing don't fully trust each other's stated red lines, they're constantly observing behavior and updating their models to figure out the other side's actual threshold for pain.
They are mathematically feeling around in the dark. So based on that continuous updating, what do the models predict?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the framework rules out a genuine, warm reconciliation. The structural differences are just too vast.
Makes sense.
It also assesses that an immediate catastrophic escalation over Taiwan, what the report calls Scenario C, is currently less likely in the short term. The cost of a hot war is simply too high for both economies right now, despite the elevated risks from the ambiguous signaling we discussed.
So if they aren't going to hold hands and they aren't going to start shooting,
Right.
What is the most likely outcome?
The highest probability, according to the modeling, is Scenario A, managed strategic stabilization.
Translating that into plain English, they just freeze the board?
They pause. Because pulling the trigger costs more than keeping the peace. The summit likely produces tangible but highly limited outcomes.
Like what?
We will see a mutual pause on tariff escalations. They will establish that Board of Trade communication channel so they can keep talking. China will make commitments to buy American agricultural products and energy.
And what about the Strait of Hormuz?
Crucially, behind closed doors, Beijing probably provides informal assurances to use its leverage in Tehran to help reopen the strait.
Okay, so Trump gets his legible economic deliverables to show the voters before the midterms, and Xi gets the tariff predictability he needs to manage China's domestic economic slowdown. They carve out a temporary truce for themselves.
Yes.
But, I mean, a bilateral deal like that doesn't happen in a vacuum. If the two biggest economies on Earth decide to solve their own problems, what happens to the rest of the world?
The rest of the world gets extremely nervous, and that leads us to the diplomatic fallout for the G7. The 52nd G7 summit is scheduled for June 2026 in Evian, France, hosted by President Macron. And the European and Japanese allies are watching this Trump-Xi summit with absolute dread.
Why, though?
Mhm.
If the two superpowers cool down their rhetoric, wouldn't Europe and Japan be relieved?
Well, they want the rhetoric to cool, yes. But they are terrified of the economic mechanisms Trump might use to achieve it.
Oh, because of the transactional nature of it.
Exactly. The allies fear that Trump's purely transactional approach will result in bilateral deals that actively cannibalize their own economies. Think about the scale of it.
Okay.
If China suddenly commits to buying massive amounts of American energy and agriculture to satisfy Washington, that artificially drives up global commodity prices for everyone else in Europe.
It's a zero-sum game.
Completely.
Yeah.
Furthermore, if China commits to massive direct investment in the U.S. to appease the administration, it displaces European and Japanese market share.
Because Washington is essentially securing its own supply chains and export markets by throwing its allies under the bus.
That is the exact fear. I mean, the G7 has spent years trying to build a collective resilience strategy. They just mobilized $6.4 billion for critical mineral diversification to break free from Chinese dominance together.
Right.
But if the U.S. abruptly pivots to a self-serving bilateral posture, it exposes severe fault lines in the Western alliance. Japan is already deeply anxious about Washington softening its stance on Taiwan, which Tokyo views not as a distant geopolitical chess piece, but as an existential security issue right on its doorstep.
So what does this all mean? If you were listening to this on May 11, 2026, heading to the grocery store, sitting in traffic, or just looking at your retirement account.
Yeah.
The reality is that the stability of your daily life is currently being negotiated on a knife's edge, thousands of miles away.
It really is.
The price you pay to heat your home, the availability of the components of the hospital equipment in your town, the general peace of the global market, it all hinges on two heavily constrained leaders agreeing to a fragile, temporary freeze in Beijing.
It is a profound diagnostic moment. This summit strips away the diplomatic pleasantries and reveals the raw structural tensions that are going to define the next decade of human history.
And that leaves us with a final thought from the source's conclusion to really mull over. We aren't going backward to a bipolar Cold War where the ideological lines were clearly drawn on a map.
No, those days are gone.
But we are also definitely not living in that harmonious, fully globalized world of the early 2000s anymore. Instead, the report argues we are entering a new era of strategic fragmentation.
Strategic fragmentation.
Yeah, so the question you have to ask yourself as you watch the news over the next few days is this. What happens to the fabric of our everyday lives when global stability is no longer maintained by shared rules, common values, or global institutions? What happens when peace is maintained simply by the mutual terrifying calculation of how much it would cost to break the system? The global engine is still running, but only because everyone at the table is too afraid of the explosion it will cause if they finally pull the plug.